I will hand over to Ruby. Ruby is a postdoc, a research fellow in Aberdeen Business School. I have been working with OGTC on this project for some time, and Ruby's going to tell you about her work on this particular topic to do with adopting new technology.
Thank you, Rona, and thank you for everybody joining us this afternoon. The structure of the next about 50 minutes or so is I will be talking for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we can have lots of time for Q&A, and you can have the opportunity to ask all the kind of questions that you might like to know. I did see if somebody had asked in the Q&A function if they could use a cat filter. Probably not, though I would love to see a screenshot of that at the end. So what we're going to be talking about is how people and organizations respond to technology. And we are going to be focusing in on the oil and gas industry. However, I feel that a lot of what we're going to be talking about will be familiar for anybody who's been working toward innovation within their own organization, whether that's in oil and gas, renewables, healthcare, etc. So I do hope that everybody within the webinar finds this to be valuable and useful. So without further ado, let's get going. So we talk about innovation all the time. We talk about it in newsletters, we see it in our inbox, we go to webinars such as this, and we can see the value of innovation. And this is particularly pertinent as we now as a society face a really big challenge around the climate change crisis, and how are we going to respond to that in a relatively short space of time. And one of the key components of doing that is thinking about how we consume and produce energy. And so we see that the oil and gas industry is starting to respond to that. They have a target of decarbonisation by 2050, and we're starting to see the introduction of things like green tech into the energy sector. And this is really exciting kind of time to see it transitioning and moving toward a more sustainable source of energy. Having said all of that, for us to be able to take advantage of the technologies and the amazing innovations that we see coming into the market every day, it requires the actual innovations and technologies to be deployed and rolled out. And this might sound like a straightforward thing, but as you're going to find out in the next 25 minutes or so, not necessarily so. So we get to a point in the oil and gas industry where we want to accelerate that innovation process. However, most of you will be aware that the oil and gas industry has a reputation for being rather slow to uptake new technology. Now, there are a set of factors that can make this particularly tricky, and such factors can include the high risk of failure. So the failure can be financial risk, or it can be safety risk, and it can even, as we'll talk about later, be individual risk. So we get to a position where we want to be accelerating technology uptake, and yet we want to do that in a sector which is well known for being sluggish toward innovation, where many companies prefer to be fast followers, second followers, and in some cases, 10th or 12th followers of a new technology. Now, this is the type of conversation that the OGTC was having around 2.5 years ago, where they're developing, really smart technologies, and they're supporting startup companies, rolling out their innovations within, a wide range of contexts, and are getting some great support from their OGTC membership. And despite all of that, what they were coming up against was they would try to roll out these technologies, and they'd maybe only get 1 or 2 trials. And it wasn't that the technology didn't show lots of promise and it didn't have competitive advantage. It was more that the technology would then be sitting on a shelf for no real good reason. So we wanted to understand, where's this resistance coming from? Now, when we're talking about innovation, typically we want to talk about the technical aspects of it. Where's the gap and the fit? What's the competitive advantage? How is this going to work? How are we going to deploy it in terms of technical aspects? And these are all valuable things that we need to prepare and plan for. However, they do tend to forget one of the really big parts about innovation and change, and that's the people and organizations that make that change successful or can act as blockers to that change. So with that kind of premise in mind, we set up a brand new research project between the OGTC and the Aberdeen Business School at Robert Gordon University. And the purpose of this was to understand what are these non-technical factors which influence technology uptake. And when I'm talking about non-technical factors, I'm specifically talking about these psychological factors that influence the decisions that we make. So what are these soft factors that are influencing technology deployment decisions? Now, deployment decisions can be to agree to trial a new technology in your work site. It can be to deploy a new piece of software across an organization, or it can be to change the way that a process works. So it's introducing some kind of innovation into an organization that otherwise wasn't there. It doesn't necessarily have to be brand new to the world, just to that organization. So we want to understand, what are these people factors? What are these psychological elements that influence these decision making? And we look at other sectors and we want to know what we can learn from them. So we look at other areas of innovation across business to understand what can we learn from them. And we run our 2-year project, and it's very exciting from an academic point of view because we have the opportunity to collect data, which hasn't really been done before. We don't really understand what these psychological factors are in terms of the academic literature. And so we do this using interviews, literature reviews, case studies, and we end up with this huge wealth of data. And we want to then do something valuable and useful with it and put it together in a meaningful way. And the way that we do that is we develop a framework, obviously, because we're academics and academics love a framework. So this is what we produce, and it's the Psychological Technology Adoption Framework. And that's what we call it the PTAF, because in all honesty, it is quite a mouthful. But that's because it represents a huge amount of data and it covers quite a lot of information. So what we found was that there were 6 overarching categories that influence these technology type decisions. And these are sometimes quite individual and individual specific, so personality and motivation. And then they would expand up to social factors, so the decisions we make in groups, right up to that organizational level. And for many of you, when you were signing up to this event, will be thinking, this is what we're talking about later on. And you'd be right. We're going to be honing in on that organizational element just a few minutes later on in the session. So we only have maybe about 20 minutes, but I would like to give you a little bit of a flavor to understand what some of these factors are and how they can influence successful technology uptake. So first things first, personality. It's what makes some people like us and some people not. But when we want to talk about technology and innovation, one of the key personality characteristics, which is particularly important, is how innovative we are. And when I'm talking about innovativeness, I'm talking about how open we are to try new things and how willing we are to perhaps try something which is out with our comfort zone. And despite maybe people's expectations of people working in oil and gas as being very conservative and risk averse, we actually found a whole host of people who were incredibly innovative and really recognized the value that innovation can offer and were quite adventurous. So we experienced and came across a range of personality differences in terms of innovativeness. Some who were very open to it and some that were a little bit more, no thank you. And we could understand their responses to technology a little bit better when we thought about the second category, which relates to attitudes. Now, our attitudes really come down to how we think, feel, and behave about a particular object or idea. And so when we're talking about technology attitudes, we're thinking about how comfortable are we with the idea of technology? What do we believe? Do we believe that they're good, it's bad, it's untrustworthy? Is it something that we like? Is it something that we know we don't? And that will all influence our behavior. So in some situations, we identified individuals who had really positive technology attitudes, and where they recognized the value that it offered and that it would provide competitive advantage, they tended to make more positive technology decisions. And by that, I mean they were more open to the idea of innovating within their organizations and were therefore more likely to interact in a positive way. Having said that, we did come across a whole range of other opinions, and we heard some real interesting stories from startups where they experience real hostility toward their new products. In some situations, They couldn't understand what the purpose of the technology was. They were completely skeptical that it produced anything. Some attitudes were around, it wasn't invented in my organization, it's not very good, it's not my idea, and so I don't own it. And so we came across all of these kind of attitudes. And you'll notice on these following slides that all of the quotes are directly taken from the data sources that we gathered as part of the project. But we can further understand attitudes when we think about trust. Now, trust is really important for any kind of decision, particularly when it involves a level of uncertainty. And when we're talking about innovation, it is inherently uncertain. We don't always know the outcome of deploying a new innovation or to try something new. So trust is really important. And we often see trust being spoken about in the media in terms of, do we trust driverless cars, etc. And this applies just in the same context for, do we trust the new technologies that are being deployed in oil and gas? And not just the technologies themselves specifically, but all of the people that are working in relation to this. So that can be the startup company, it can be the service provider, it can be the leadership who perhaps sign off on this technology, and all of these different trust relationships can interact. And that's really important for understanding risk-taking and risk aversion, as we'll talk about in a few moments. Another key understanding around how people make decisions and the attitudes that they hold are the motivations that drive their behavior. Now, we identified in the data sources a wide range of motivations for why people may make positive or negative decisions. So some of these may relate to the desire to be part of something new and to be innovative. Those motivations may be related to how might this impact on company safety and performance. But the absolutely most common motivation we found related to impersonal incentive. And that really came down to self-preservation. So what's in it for me, and how might deploying this new technology impact on me? So as an example, if you imagine yourself as a manager or a technology lead in an operating company, and a startup comes to you with a new technology and you think it's pretty good idea, but you have a thought in your mind of, if this goes wrong, what happens? I may well be up for contract renewal. My job may be in a dangerous situation. And if this goes wrong, how might this negatively impact on me? And we see that a lot, not just in oil and gas, but across the business spectrum of how might these decisions impact negatively on me. So we have an understanding of what these attitudes and motivations are, and they also influence how we make decisions, so our cognition around new technology. And when we talk about innovation, we talk about risk. And this is even more so if you're talking about risk and innovation in oil and gas. But I think it's important to point out that the majority of time when we're talking about risk, we're talking about our perception of it. And that's a subjective thing, rather than a risk as an objective, statistically estimatable number and likelihood of something occurring. It's much more commonly to do with our perception and what we're comfortable with. And our risk perception will be influenced by our prior experience. So have we used technologies that we think are perhaps similar? And did we think it went successfully? Did it all go wrong the last time? And what's our expertise around this? So to be able to make an accurate risk assessment for anything, whether that's to do with introducing a new piece of technology or deciding whether to go and drive in the snow, you need to have the requisite expertise and knowledge to make that decision. So you need to know quite a lot about it to be able to make a fair assessment. And this is where we started to see a slight issue occurring, where individuals who were making those decisions or being asked to make those decisions maybe didn't have the requisite expertise and knowledge to do so. And that's not because they're bad individuals, but because they may well be doing 900 tasks in a day. They may have several roles that they're trying to cover, and they really don't have the time and energy to maintain an active level of technology or area that they're interested in or are required to make decisions about. Now we want to move on and think about, well, how do we make decisions then as part of groups? Now, if I wanted to buy a new phone, for example, I would probably ask my family members and my friends and people whose opinion I respect. And this is just the same when we look at it in an industrial kind of workplace context. And this is what we see. So when an individual perhaps doesn't have that relevant expertise, or they are feeling a little unsure about it, what they'll go and do is they'll go and ask their colleagues and their peers and individuals who are in similar roles. And so we see a really active role in terms of peer networks and peer influence. And this can be really positive because you can introduce things like product champions and individuals who can really support this, or what you can see as a herd instinct. And a herd instinct is not a particularly attractive way of describing it, but in some situations it is accurate. It essentially means where one company has deployed a technology or is considering using it, it makes it more attractive to other ones, and they're more likely to take part. Whereas if absolutely nobody's doing it, it's very much more difficult to try to introduce this piece of technology. And we saw that in several case studies where perhaps only one company was involved. It made it a much more slow deployment progress. So we also work as part of organizations. We do not work in a bubble. We are influenced by the organizational cultures for which we are part of and for which we influence. And when I'm talking about organizational culture, I'm talking about the way that we do things in a particular organization. So what do we prioritize? Where do we spend our time and money? What do we think is worth our time and effort? And what are the processes and procedures that we have in place to drive those underlying beliefs? And as one senior manager from one of our interviews put it, it comes down to that digital DNA. Now, this is particularly interesting because we started to see a lot more influence around organizational culture when we started to wrap the 2-year project up. And a big part of that 2-year project was being able to use this empirical evidence and do something valuable, something that might have an impact with it. And we did this by developing 3 deliverables. The first was an innovativeness measure. So that's going back to our personality stuff. And that could be used to measure how open somebody is, particularly if they're in a key decision-making role. The second was around supporting startups and being able to provide them some guidance on how they can get over some of these psychological hurdles when they try to go for commercialization. And the final is around organizational culture, because we expect startups to consider their technology readiness levels and how ready they are to go to market. But we spend a lot less time thinking about how open and responsive an adopting organization is. And so this is where our organizational technology adoption measure comes in. So if we think back to our much bigger, broader perspective of moving toward energy transition and sustainable energy sources and how we're going to do that, one of the ways that you can start to drive change and support that change is looking at the organizational culture. And if you want to start somewhere, you have to know roughly where you sit. You have to know if you're good, bad, ugly. You have to have a picture of that. And so we wanted to use this preliminary or MVP version for some benchmarking. And if we can do benchmarking, we can give a gauge of where the industry sits in terms of technology culture. And just a short note on that, when we talk about innovation, we all probably have different ideas of what we mean. So specifically for this, we're talking about innovation adoption. And the reason that we wanted to look at innovation adoption rather than creation is evidence suggests that this is where the real barrier lies. It's not necessarily that, oil and gas or energy sector is not creative. We see some amazing stuff coming out of R&D, and there's some incredibly innovative startups. The bottleneck appears to occur when we want to see that being deployed in a long-term sustainable way. So with that in mind, we developed a 34-item questionnaire. Now, these are the same kind of questionnaires from which most of you on the call will have taken part in at some point in your lives. It's the kind where they have a short statement, which you then respond to on a scale of 1 to 5, from disagree to agree. Now, relatively straightforward, and we thought that this was really valuable, and so we decided to extend the project with the OGTC to then take this measure and run it as part of a pilot benchmarking study. And we wanted to do that so that we could produce a leadership or leaderboard, so we could understand where are we in terms of the industry. So we ran this We ran this survey between December and January, and let me tell you, this is not the best time to run a survey just before Christmas, after a whole year of everything that we've all been through. It was a little bit tricky trying to get everybody involved. However, having said all of that, we invited 12 companies to take part, and these were all operating companies who were OGTC members. And we wanted them to be OGTC members because we're on the assumption that if they're taking part in this type of an organization, they're relatively already open to the idea of innovation and new technology. And from these 12 companies, all of them took part, and we managed to get a response of 82 individuals. And I think this really highlights the value that they see in this type of a tool and this type of measuring approach. And so we ran the pilot survey. It is important to note it was completely anonymous and it's closed benchmarking. So that means that the only thing I know about those 82 participants is which organization they worked for. I can't say anything else about that. And that it's closed benchmarking. So of those 12 operating companies, those would all receive a short 2-page summary of their results. And they would see roughly what you're about to see in a moment, which is the mean industry scores, but they would not see anybody else's scores. And they also do not know who the other organizations are that took part. We would be very keen in being able to do this in a much larger sample, because we'd be able to make kind of comment on how do different types of organization and size of organization experience and respond to culture. But as a pilot, this is where we started. And so with that in mind, let me show you our set of results. So what you're looking at in front of you are the key 8 categories which we identified as being important for developing a positive innovation adoption culture. Now, they are on a 1 to 5 scale. So I can't say what is good, what is bad, or what is excellent. I can only say to what degree the participants on average believe that these exist in the industry. So having said that, we can look straight across the table and you'll see across those 8 categories, some of those might be surprising and some of them might not so much be. So first off, on the left-hand side, we can see leadership. We can see that there's some relative support to leadership, and that's pretty good. And we found a wide range. Some organizations had a lot of support from leadership in terms of technology adoption, and they were very keen to support it. And often innovation would be a part of their organizational strategy. Now, this leadership component very closely links into a category shown roughly in the middle, which is innovation value. And that comes down to how is innovation valued within the organization? How is it perceived? Do people feel that this provides a competitive advantage? Or is it frankly something that they don't really want to do and it's more of a nice to have rather than essential aspect of their culture? You'll note again that collaboration across the board is a category for which most of the companies which took part, they were all performing pretty well on. And this was a wonderful, wonderful thing to see that collaboration was starting to be something that was valued within these companies. And this collaboration is talking about how they share and collaborate with both internal and external individuals. So that can be working internally, but it can also be working with tech startups, other operating companies, service companies. We do notice that there's a slight drop compared to open communication. So open communication is more to do with internal communication. So it does suggest that whilst operating companies are very good at collaborating externally, they do tend to find it more difficult to share some of these learnings and knowledge internally. And we see that being replicated further along the graph around organizational learning and competence. Now, the organizational learning and competence harks back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of having expertise and knowledge to make accurate risk assessments. So it's really covering, does the organization have knowledge to be able to identify potential upcoming technologies and their applications and to be able to make accurate risk perceptions. And you'll notice that both organizational learning and risk-taking are some of the lower scoring categories there. And it's not really surprising if we think about this. The other aspect that's important to mention around organizational learning and competence is being able to share knowledge and insights from when we've done some kind of deployment project, and we can then share our key lessons. Now, when I asked the 12 operating companies, all individually as part of their workshops, did they have some kind of a method for measuring or capturing some of these learnings? Lots of them were very pleased to tell me that they did, but were a little bit more stumped when I asked them how did they share their mistakes and how did they share where things had gone wrong. And that's really important to have, because if you have the knowledge and expertise around how you respond to failure, it's much quicker to accelerate that technology adoption process and to be able to do things like failing fast. And it also influences how we then think and feel about risk-taking. And how do we feel about it? Are we comfortable with it? Are we not comfortable with it? And this also feeds into our implementation context. Implementation context is that overarching environment that supports the organizational culture. So these can be having human resources and finances to be able to support it. It can also be things like procurement procedures. So you do your procurement procedures support innovative bids, or are you expecting new technologies to conform to the same procurement procedures you would for something which was the standard off-the-shelf product? So we can see across the graph, it's a wide range of responses. Some of these categories are generally performed poorer, such as risk-taking for technology adoption and organizational learning, whereas others are quite promising in terms of collaboration and leadership. Now, I would imagine that most of you who are logged into this would like to have a little bit of sneak peek. You've given me 20 minutes of your life, so in return, I will give you some quick tips on how you might think about supporting your own organizational culture. So if you are in a position of being a technology lead or somebody who's looking to improve that culture and is frankly having a moment of struggling and not quite sure where to start, my always first suggestion is to think about leadership and vision. This is the real fundamental foundation of any culture, whether it's to do with innovation culture or technology or even safety. Leadership really set the tone. So it's first of all, is to think about how do your leadership value innovation? Is it something which is valuable, or is it something which is more of a nice to have? How does that fit into an overall strategy? And how are these messages communicated? Now, sometimes we see mixed messages where explicitly leadership will really support innovation, say it's great, let's do this, but this is not followed up by actions. And instead, what comes through is an implicit message of actually it's not really that important at all. And this will closely link into innovation value. So within your own organizations, are innovation activities prioritized? Are they something that people spend time on? Is it something that management ask about and highlight and pick up? Do people talk about them? Is it something which is part of the culture, or is it something which you're just trying to introduce now? Now, I've mentioned throughout this presentation risk maybe 3 or 4 times, and many of you may be quite rightly thinking oil and gas industry should be very tentative toward risk, given the consequences that can occur. And in no way am I disagreeing with that. But innovation in itself is risky, and it doesn't necessarily always guarantee the outcome. So if you want to understand how your culture feels about risk, my very first and trickiest question is, should the technology not work as expected? And by expected, it doesn't necessarily have to fail or cause a huge furore or do anything particularly bad. It might just not meet return on investment or something like that. What might the reaction be? Will management support this? Will there be repercussions? Or is there an understanding that some innovations will not always work and that there needs to be an acceptance of failure within that culture for new technology? And now, if all of those suggestions just seem really far too hard and not quite sure how you're going to do that, my very last one is much more doable. So most of us in some way have been involved in introducing new technology, whether that's introducing a new piece of equipment on an offshore field, or whether it's suddenly starting to use Zoom webinar because we're all at home and having to do this online. Does your organization have any way of sharing the lessons that they have gathered. And if you can institute even an informal way of sharing experiences and learnings, it can help to support expertise. It can really bolster things like open communication and collaboration, and it can have a really strong knock-on effect, and to illustrate that there's actually value sometimes in failure, and we can learn a lot from it, and that can influence risk-taking and innovation value, etc., etc. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a pilot survey. I will be honest with all 33 of you on the call, we weren't quite sure how this was going to go. This is not something that's been done before. And it isn't only an initial benchmark. Some of the organizations perhaps did not get the scores that they were looking for. But nonetheless, we had a really positive response from those who took part. For many of them, they were in the middle of trying to revise their technology strategies. They're looking toward the future and how might they plan part of innovation as part of their strategies and moving forward. And so for them, this provided an unbiased baseline, so somewhere that they could work to. And so even when those results were not necessarily what they wanted, they still got something really valuable out of it. I would just highlight at this point, we have our pilot, we're coming toward an end of this, and we are looking for deployment partners. So if this is something that sounds like it would be valuable to your organization, or that you might like to deploy in your particular sector, and that does not have to be specific to oil and gas, we are quite open to seeing how this might work in other sectors and industries, please do get in contact. You'll see my email address is on the lower right-hand corner of the slide. So for the last, 30 minutes, we've been talking about quite a specific area around technology in oil and gas. And you might be thinking, quite rightly, how does this work in terms of the bigger picture? Well, I've included our lovely blue marble on one of my final slides, not just because it's a beautiful photograph, but it illustrates how small we are and that we really do need to work together toward how we consume and produce energy. And the oil and gas industry is starting to make strides towards green technology and are starting to take this really seriously. But if we want to accelerate it, being able to use the innovation which is being created is a really key component of that. So whilst this might seem like a 2-year research project, it can actually have quite far-reaching implications. So that's everything that I would like to say. Thank you for giving me a whole 30 minutes of quiet, uninterrupted time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. If there are any particular questions that I'm unable to answer in the following chat, please do email me, and my email address is at the lower part of the corner. And if this is something that you might be interested in working on with us, please do get in contact today or tomorrow. Thank you, Rona. I'm quite happy to hand back now.
Thank you, Ruby. That was excellent, a very concise and enthusiastic summary of I know there's a lot of data to collect and gather, and trying at the moment to set up the first pass at the pilot benchmarking. I think was quite an achievement. So I can just remind the audience, if you've got questions, if you could type them into the Q&A, and apart from the cat filter question, which Ruby's dealt with, we can see that the next question, I don't know if you can see this yourself, Ruby, you're being asked, do you have any examples of best practice for internal programs within technology adoption organizations which have brought about excellent results? And that's in terms of bringing through a lot of innovation or high quality innovation, or increasing or more widespread adoption. I know we've not got to the kind of learning phase of this particular benchmarking exercise, but I know you've talked to a lot of companies in the process. So are there any examples you can think of where companies are doing this well?
Okay, well, thank you, Alex. I can tell you about it more next Thursday. I think we have a call then. But yeah, there are a lot of activities that you can take part in. I think the first is around gathering those lessons and being able to learn from your prior mistakes. If you're able to learn from these mistakes, you can accelerate that innovation uptake process. Having some method of communicating those lessons and where people are working on innovation. So that can be an informal thing of a regular 30-minute call, maybe once every 2 weeks. It can be an innovation network forum. So we've seen for some of the companies who are performing well. They have set up innovation network forums, and they hold these regularly. And the purpose of these is not just to have a moan about actually how difficult this is, but to share the technologies that they're using, what's working well, what's not working. And this allows people to share contacts, to broaden their social networks, and to have access to information and different people that they otherwise wouldn't have. And it also highlights that if you're spending time doing this, this is something valuable and worthwhile. So those would be my first two starters. Where we've also seen some great best practices, it's been around procurement procedures. So where you have procurement procedures that are slightly amended for new innovative practices. So if your procurement procedure normally would like 3 quotes for a particular product or service, that doesn't look really well if it's a brand new service and it's disruptive, because there's no 2 other comparable, quotes that can be given, and that can make it really difficult. And so procurement can often get a little bit muddled with that. And where we've seen it work really well is that they slightly amend those practices, so we can service companies can submit quotes which otherwise they wouldn't be able to. I know that one organization which is doing particularly well, they have a festival or an online activity for their service companies where they actively sell the message of innovation, that they want to hear innovative ideas and they want them to pitch new technologies to them. And so those service companies and technology providers are much more likely to offer and to share different ideas that they otherwise would have. So there's the first kind of 3 that pop into my mind.
Ruby, before we take the
please
next,
do email me.
Before we take the next question, and maybe we should add that the pilot study with the 12 operators has only just gone to the measurement phase, and I know there's a workshop planned with all these organizations in the near future. But I guess subsequent phase of that benchmarking is where you get to the sharing, if companies are willing to do this, where we identify high scorers, and then they reveal what kinds of things they're doing, whether low scorers want to identify what they're doing, but the learning is often in the direction of picking up from the scores where people in the company think they're doing, like you say, the learning bit very well. Well, exactly what is it they're doing? Because I think that's where a lot of the benefits of being in one of these benchmarking pools comes from.
Yeah. I think nearly, I think that the only thing I would add to that is that some companies, and this is quite interesting, they feel that what they're doing and their best practices are actually what gives them a competitive advantage, which is a total switch around. Before, we didn't think, there was the attitude that innovation, it doesn't really give that much of an advantage. And now it's switched around completely, that what they're doing and their forums and the various procurement procedures and all these things that they're doing are actually what are providing them competitive advantage, and that's quite interesting to see.
Yeah, and that's a real concern. I think when we ran benchmarking years ago from Robert Gordon's, it was safety benchmarking, and I think people saw that as a bit more of a common interest in everybody protecting their installations. So we've got 2 more questions. The next question, just going off the screen, was could you comment on the theme of skills capability in developing innovation? I guess that was a little bit in the first phase of work, looking at the psychological factors.
Could you comment on the theme skills capability in having developed? So are we talking about the capabilities to having the knowledge to develop that innovation culture?
I think so. Individually, if you're going to help staff develop and help to foster that innovation culture, what kinds of skills and training do you want to be thinking about?
So I would definitely recommend considering if you're looking to put together a team that can do that, there are individuals who are first and foremost innovative. It's not that helpful to have an innovation team which aren't particularly innovative, and there are ways that you can select people particularly for these types of roles. You will probably want somebody or types of skills which are relatively flexible and able to work in a rapidly changing environment where things are often changed, who are not necessarily focused on traditional methods and maybe are more open to the idea of working in a different way. You'd also need to have a high level of technical capability so to have some knowledge of that technical area that you want to innovate within. So if it's in asset integrity, you do need to have individuals within that team who know where the key problem areas are in the sector and what are the technologies which are traditionally used and what's coming to market. And if you don't have that technical expertise, where can you get it from? So having people who are well connected and know where to access these different individuals, whether they're in places like the OGTC or the OGA or even within particular startup companies or service companies, it's knowing where to get the different pieces of knowledge from. Is it that kind of thing that we're thinking about?
Yeah, I think so. The questioner can come back and tell you if that you've just answered.
Sure. If I didn't answer your question correctly, please drop me an email and I'm happy to give you maybe a more thorough question.
Okay, so the next question says, I think the literature shows that people value the risk of loss more than the upsides of gain. And as psychologists, I guess we would confirm that certainly is in the studies of risk. And Neil, who's this question, says, I think this is absolutely the case with technology deployment. Do you agree? How, in an organizational context, can we reduce risk perception and promote the gains to overcome that bias? I guess there's an interesting point there about is the risk perception accurate or not? Is it a bias or, well, I'll leave that to you, Ruby.
So thank you, Neil. Yes, risk aversion was one of those things that popped up throughout the 2.5-year project, and we saw it popping up, whether that was in interviews or case studies or literature review or even just general conversations that we were having with people in the industry. So this is, yes, definitely something that we're seeing. Human psychology tells us that we, overly emphasize and fixate on the potential loss than we do on the potential gains. So yep, definitely agree. How can, in an organizational context, we reduce risk perception and promote the gains that overcome that bias? So I think this comes down to what we determine or perceive to be risky. So if you then take the same context and you apply it in a different industry where the overall risk perception is slightly different, you might find a slightly different response. So for example, in finance, we see a much lower risk tolerance or a much higher risk tolerance, and so risk perception is slightly different. Oh, let me just go back and see if I can answer it properly.
No, you won't, because Claire's just deleted.
Yeah, there we go. Hang on, I can find it. So if we want to do this in terms of an organizational culture, I think it comes down to a couple of things. It's how do you reward innovation activities? So are you rewarding people on only having a positive outcome? Because if you only reward them on a positive outcome, that tells them that only a positive is a good thing, but actually the effort that you put into it, that's also a valuable thing. It also comes down to how do you trust and what is the relationship like between the people involved? So do they trust that if something goes wrong, that there'll be repercussions? And if they do, that risk perception will just skyrocket out of the roof. So there is an element to do with trust, and how do you develop that trust? There will still always be that underlying human psychology around risk aversion. You can't entirely reduce that, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we do. It is there for a useful reason, particularly within the oil and gas industry, where you can have some serious safety consequences. But there are ways that you can start to get around that in terms of developing trust, considering how you reward it, having certain context, so you can even reduce risk perceptions if you apply that particular technology in a lower risk scenario. So having something like a sandbox scenario, or if we're thinking about a particular example off the top of my head, where it was a brand new piece of drilling equipment, for example, what they did is, rather than taking that drilling equipment out into the North Sea, they took it to a land rig, and then they worked out that it worked fine and there were no safety concerns. And so it's a way of applying the technology in a lower risk situation, having evidence that it works, and then moving it up into higher risk situations. There are ways of doing it, but it is quite tricky.
I wonder if also it's linked a little bit to the leadership issue, in that as we know in the work on safety commitment, which is an area I've worked in quite a lot, a lot of it's about very subtle signals that more senior managers give. So you can say, I'm very supportive of innovation, you're at no risk, but how particular behaviors are rewarded or acknowledged, or the kinds of jokes, there's a lot of subtle things going on in that culture where people might think, I don't know if I want to stick my head out here on this new product, because I'm not really sure my manager or up the line that they are truly committed to innovation, and this could be a career dent for me if it goes badly. So I guess there's quite subtle signals, I guess, in organizations about how innovation is being supported.
Yeah, and I think also we, from an Aberdeen-centric point of view, feel that this only happens in oil and gas, but we see that happening, across the energy sector and in a range of other industries where you're asked to make a particular decision and you really wonder what will happen when you make that decision. If it goes well, then it's my Rona Flynn who's clapped and given a well done. It's my supervisor who's rewarded. But if something goes wrong, will it be me that's heads on the line for it? Sometimes that reward cost benefit analysis isn't always that straightforward.
Okay, well, and the next question is Neil telling you he thought that was a brilliant response.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Neil. That's always nice to hear.
I've got a question, Ruby, in terms of, you mentioned this is a slightly different world. We're now on Zoom webinars, etc. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about whether the whole COVID, the year of lockdown on and off, do you think that in any way is changing people's attitudes towards, I know it's changing our attitudes to some technologies like webinar, but do you think that that's going to have any ripple effect through general attitudes, or do you think in kind of the big tech companies that we're looking at, it's not going to have an effect?
I think given the year that we've all experienced in slight shock and horror, it would be really difficult for it to not influence how we think and feel about technologies. We're doing this on Zoom webinar. It's something that we've been doing for the last year. I must say I was quite resistant to it to begin with, and then went, oh, this is much easier and I can wear my slippers at the same time. And I hear the same kind of conversations happening throughout the year. So I do feel that people will be more open to the idea of using technology in a way that they maybe hadn't before. We wouldn't have had online really webinars before, and so this is something that we might be more open to. On the same token, lots of people's jobs are up for redundancy. They're all doing much more work. Their workload's increased, and there's also this level of uncertainty. So we might have a kind of balanced situation where it looks roughly the same. The value that innovation has given us to work remotely and to be able to do things that we never thought we could is kind of probably leveled off by the uncertainty of the pandemic and not quite sure how things are going to work out. How are the markets going to respond to that? That's my best guess at this point, without a magic ball.
And the other question I had is, I wondered whether, this was just a sample of operating companies. Do you have any sense if we work with at the contractor side of the industry? I mean, I know you're interested maybe looking at other industries, and we may have people from other sectors on the call, but is there any sense that the operators are more risk averse than maybe their contractor companies?
So my feeling from the whole project, which is not based on empirical evidence of why I would feel that, is it's not necessarily true. So if you ask an operator who is of, say, a large size, they will say it's easier for a small service company to innovate because they're smaller, and that's more driven as part of their organizational village. And then if you ask said smaller service company, they will say that large operator is much more likely to innovate because they're larger and have bigger budgets. And so there's this kind of, well, he said, she said situation. So I'm not sure if it's as straightforward as service companies are more innovative than operating companies, or vice versa, or that big are better or small is better. I think it's probably more driven by leadership and the organizational strategy that's driving that. Do they see innovation a part of it or not really? Or
the grass is just greener on the other side of the field.
Of course it is.
looking over the wall. Okay, I think that's the audience have asked their questions, and you've done very well answering them so fully. And you've also told people that they can. You're happy to take emails, and your emails.
Yeah, happy to take emails.
With other people interested in taking part in this kind of thing, or just any questions that they've got for you. So I think as they've got just a few minutes left before people need to get on their 3 o'clock call, to just say thank you very much, Ruby, for giving us an excellent overview. Oh, we've got one more question just in the last couple of minutes. This is Colin asking, in our experience, you start with field proven technology, but it's new to your asset. Then once you've delivered the value and understand the change management process and people skills required. I don't know if that, I mean, it's obviously a comment for the whole session. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Ruby, because it's not really a question.
Yeah. So thanks, Colin, and thank you for Colin for joining us for today's session. Colin was very helpful in promoting it online. So thanks for that, Colin. I know that you and Eric have a lot of experience in rolling out these deployment type projects. And I think understanding that change management process is a fundamental part, and people fit in that. And I think from certainly my experience, I'm not sure how you feel about it, Rona, but it's during the course of the project, it's only highlighted that more. You know, at the beginning of the project, I thought people are pretty important in these decision making. And now I will, you know, get on my soapbox and shout about the importance of how we all influence those decisions. So I definitely agree with you, Colin.
Okay, with any final questions, if we just wait a minute in case anybody has any burning issue. I think that's it, Ruby. So thank you very much to all of those who are still on the webinar. I hope you found that useful, informative, thought-provoking, and thanks very much to Ruby for giving us such an excellent overview of what's remaining a very current and important topic to the industry. So thanks very much, Ruby, and I would just encourage the audience to look at the other webinars we've got in our Business Knowledge Bites series, because they're running through the rest of the year on all kinds of topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rona. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon.